Our faith calls us to live with love, justice, compassion, responsibility, and a sense of our belongingness to all on earth, as well as our debt to the past and the future. Therefore, we include, even in this time of social distance, a regular ritual of land acknowledgement to the first peoples who, before the incursions of the Europeans, inhabited and stewarded for millennia this land on which we live today. The names of those who are in our area are before you on the screen. We acknowledge our debt to these peoples and pay our respects to elders past and present, still displaced. May this be no empty recognition, but part of our commitment to know the truths of history and to shape the future of this nation, to better fulfill our aspirations for love, justice, compassion, responsibility, and interdependence.
Listen to the voice of the hour, calling us together, calling us to worship, rejecting the cacophony of slick voices, luring every person to consume things, mountains of plastic, castles of straw and blood, houses of falsehoods, fears, and hatreds. Instead, we come here to be shaped by things of real worth, meaning, compassion, equity, justice, love, and respect, and to take them into our hearts and hands to deliver into the world.
If you have a candle or chalice at home, I invite you to light it as I light this chalice. We light the chalice, symbol of our living tradition. The flame is small and dancing, but the tradition is great and vibrant, made of the voices of a timeless spirit, and history of hearing and evolving, made by each courageous choice to speak deep and life affirming truths and to hear and be changed by them. And let us join together in the words of our covenant. We unite to strengthen the bonds of kinship among all persons, to promote human dignity, and to increase reverence for life's creating, sustaining, and transforming power through worship, study, and service. These are challenging times. Therefore, let us take time together in prayer and meditation. Spirit of life and love, ground of being. In these days, may we find within ourselves and in covenant with one another the sources of clarity, compassion, resilience, and courage to navigate our times with principle, with peace, and with purpose, with one another, and in a spirit of life and love. We will be blessed, and we can make it so. Amen.
Our reading this morning is from Hannah Arendt from her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. She wrote, "Before they seize power and establish a world according to their doctrines, totalitarian movements conjure up a lying world of consistency which is more adequate to the needs of the human mind than reality itself, in which through sheer imagination uprooted masses can feel at home and are spared the never-ending shocks which real life and real experiences deal to human beings and their expectations. The force possessed by totalitarian propaganda before the movements have the power to drop iron curtains to prevent anyone's disturbing by the slightest reality the gruesome quiet of an entirely imaginary world, lies in its ability to shut the masses off from the real world. So ends the reading.
Faith of the Free. Today I'll be focusing on our fourth principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Our principles, our Unitarian Universalist principles, are like a compass. The center is the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and the arrow moves freely as we live our lives, but stays pointed toward the interdependent web of existence of which we are a part. The compass upholds each life, offers guides to sustain life, and reminds us that we are always connected to a larger whole. When people come to our faith, I know they feel respected because of the first principle. They feel safe and hopeful in light of the justice, equity, and compassion in our second principle. They feel welcomed and curious because of our third principle, the acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth, which we'll address in November. Our fourth principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, signals liberation for their minds, our minds. This principle expresses our rejection of theological creed. It grew out of the struggles of clergy through centuries to freely and honestly preach their conscience. In 16th century Transylvania and Poland, when King John Sigismund declared the very first edict of religious toleration, it allowed each person to honor the insight of their minds, and it allowed clergy to do the same. So if you believed that Jesus was the Son of God, or that Jesus was another aspect of God, or that Jesus was just a superb human being, you weren't a heretic, just free. In the latter half of the 17th century, the British Parliament declared an act of uniformity, requiring all churches and clergy to use identical texts, rituals, interpretations of Scripture. Thousands of clergy lost their standing, and so began a time of resistance and the rise of nonconformism. New nonconformist movements like the Methodists, Quakers, English Moravians, and Unitarians organized and met. Each religion wanted freedom to believe as they believed. Our Unitarian forebears wanted the right of conscience and the utter freedom of the pulpit for clergy. They wanted the freedom to explore, to grow, to change, and not be declared heretics. In America, the struggle continued over creed. As most of you know, we were part of the Congregationalist Church here until the early 19th century. Then, congregations began to call more liberal clergy. The Congregationalists objected, and the split came in 1820 with the Unitarians able to keep for ourselves all the cool old New England church buildings. By the late 19th century, our congregations were places for the unfettered exploration of theology among clergy and laity both. This history means that when you come here, we assume you're on a life journey, that what you affirm now about God, the afterlife, angels, and such may and probably will change. It also means we invite you to freely and responsibly seek, and we hope that you'll challenge yourself to grow and evolve. You have freedom to explore religious language, freedom to use the metaphors meaningful to you. You have freedom. but you also have responsibility. This is unfortunately the principle that gives people the mistaken impression that Unitarian Universalists can believe anything we want. True, when it comes to dogmas about the saints or the existence of God or gods, an afterlife or afterlives, the incarnation or rising of Jesus, and so forth, you're free, as long as you exercise that freedom while being respectful of the freedom of others in the congregation and in the world. So that's one sense of responsibility that limits our freedom to believe. Another sense of responsibility that constrains us is that all the other principles we affirm and promote do operate like a compass. So if your beliefs violate the inherent worth and dignity of other people, they won't fit. If your beliefs support the notion of, let's say, totalitarianism or an absolute ruler, that would violate our affirmation of the democratic process and its respect for the lives and freedoms of others. Our principles don't give clear-cut answers or a list of do's and don'ts, like you must have a 3/5 majority for a vote, or only consensus is truly democratic, or everyone should meditate, or like whatever. They aren't a blueprint, but our principles offer a compass-like guidance. We can seek meaning the world over as long as we are not violating the web of life while we're doing it. Maybe some of you remember an old movie called The Collector. It was about a lepidopterist, someone who collects butterflies. Early in the movie, you see his collection, hundreds of beautiful butterflies pinned through the thorax onto display boards. Creepy. But I guess there really are good, actual lepidopterists. In the film, the collector sees a beautiful woman and he kidnaps her to, as he says, add her to his collection of beautiful things. Somehow, in the slippery slope of his mind, the meaning he derives from collecting bugs justifies collecting this person. It's a decent example of an irresponsible search. Truth, meaning. These days, what I'm wrestling with is this question: what on earth has befallen the truth? We have a principle dedicated to the freedom to seek the truth. I suspect most of us, maybe all of us, are alarmed at the neglect, the obfuscations and distortions done by businesses and politicians to facts, history, reality, and science. You know it, and I know it. And don't mistake this for a partisan rant. This is about the slippery slope of history, the vulnerability of the truth, and how we can find or create some hope. And it's about the level of cultural isolation in which we live. I like TikTok. But if I believed that what streams to my phone was a portrait of reality, I'd be deluded. The world isn't just full of Black people finding strength and hope, white people affirming that Black lives matter, Indigenous people proudly owning their culture, trans folk finding their place in the sun, and old people dancing with families who lovingly spend time with them. I wish it was. But I know there's another TikTok and another world that looks like the perverted parallel universe of mine, where everything has gone ugly, mean, and wrong. Let's start with a little honesty. Most people, even I dare say ourselves sometimes, wish that life were simpler and the truth, especially the big ones like the meaning of life, etc., more ironclad and clear. That's why I like my TikTok stream. It's simple. It's why religion can so easily get people to believe and do all sorts of things, hoping that safety, order, clarity will come out of it. Some things are pretty harmless, like not eating milk and meat together because it's like eating a creature in its mother's milk, a sort of moral offense. Or eating fish on Friday to honor the sacrifice of Jesus. Breaking bread together, sharing communion is harmless, even beautiful, until people kill each other because one group believes the wine and wafer become the real body and blood of Jesus, and another thinks they're symbolic. Then things are getting out of hand. It's harmless to honor a deceased man by burning his body on a beautiful pyre. It's an outrage when you require his widow to burn there with him. Still, for the sake of order and simplicity, human beings have for millennia abandoned the sight of truth in exchange for an orderly fiction, even when it's cruel and outrageous. The truth, facts, even the evidence of the eyes is vulnerable, not only because of the craving for simplicity, but because of the human drive to belong, to be safe, and not to stand out.
You'll be taking part in today involves the perception of lengths of lines. As you can see here, I have a number of cards, and on each card there are several lines. Your task is a very simple one. You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the three lines on the right is equal to it in length. All right, we'll proceed in this order. You'll give your answer.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with the white t-shirt. The others are confederates of the experimenter and have been told to give wrong answers on some of the trials. The experiment begins uneventfully as subjects give their judgments.
2,
2,
2,
2,
2, 3,
3,
3,
3.
But on the third trial, something happens.
2, 2,
2,
2,
2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
1,
Ash found subjects went along with the group on 37% of the critical trials. But he found through interviews that they went along with the group for different reasons.
1,
1.
They must be right. There are 4 of them and 1 of me. 1,
This subject's yielding is based on a distortion of his judgment. He genuinely believes that the group is correct.
1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2,
2.
I know they're wrong, but why should I make waves?
2,
In this case, the subject knows he is right, but goes along to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with the group. Here, the distortion is at the level of his response.
2.
2, 2, 2,
In the previous experiment, the naive subject stood alone against the group. In this variation, Ash gave the naive subject a partner, here seated in the third position, who also gives the correct response.
1,
1, 2,
1, 2,
With a partner, yielding drops to only 5% of the critical trials compared to 37% without a partner. Although subjects report warmth and good feeling toward the partner, they typically deny that he played a role in their own independence. The partnership variation shows that much of the power of the group came not merely from its numbers, but from the unanimity of its opposition. When that unanimity is punctured, the group's power is greatly reduced. Sometimes we go along with the group because what they say convinces us they are right. This is called informational conformity. But sometimes we conform because we are apprehensive that the group will disapprove if we are deviant. This is called normative conformity. The strength of the normative factor is shown in another variation carried out by Ash. In this variation, the subject is told that because he had arrived late, he would have to write his answers. Subjects in this private response experiment are exposed to the same amount of misleading information as other subjects, but they are immune from any possible criticism by the group.
1, 1, 1.
And this enormously reduces the pressure to conform. Conformity drops by 2/3.
2.
Ash's experiment is a classic. It reveals how people will deny what they see and submit to group pressure. It allows us not only to observe conformity, but to study the conditions that increase or reduce its occurrence.
When the naive subject in Solomon Ash's experiment goes along with the group instead of rejecting the evidence of his eyes, he's teaching himself to live with what's called a cognitive dissonance or distortion. This is when reality or facts collide with an idea that one refuses to release. If you assault people's minds with enough cognitive dissonance, it can erode the capacity to see and accept the reality before their eyes, or that's proven by rigorous methods. Political leaders have known this for centuries. They've known that the facts, truth, reality are fragile in the face of the human hunger for order, simplicity, and belonging. But not until Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, Mao, and even more for some current leaders have they had the power to distort the truth on such a massive scale. Hannah Arendt studied this phenomenon most closely in her germinal book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. She wrote, quote, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, the reality of experience as fact, the distinction between true and false standards of thought no longer exists. People for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists." She was wise. You think that folks who deny climate change don't know this? For example, in 1951, Hannah Arendt described it like this, quote, "Before mass leaders seize the power to fit reality to their lies, their propaganda is marked by its extreme contempt for facts as such. For in their opinion, fact depends entirely on the power of man who can fabricate it." End of quote. Before they seize the power to fit reality to their lies. We can be too tolerant. Harm is done in treating as valid ideas that are disrespectful of reality. For example, treating people who dismiss climate change and its impact as simply another opinion worth hearing out. When it's a deliberate strategy on the part of short-sighted and greedy elites to put their profit margins ahead of all life on Earth. Or treating arguments against evolution as another possible model of history. Creationism or intelligent design is a religious belief, that's well and good. But it cannot be permitted to displace or even stand beside provable facts. It can't be allowed to stand beside reality that is proven all around. The truth needs allies. A number of years ago, I visited the Creation Museum in Kentucky, and it looks like an airtight hall of real and faithful science versus fake evolution. The truth needs allies, and I wanted to shout, oh, for Lord's sake, let's get some real science in here. Hitler's creation of the lie of Jewish conspiracy to take over the world was built upon long-standing prejudices and entirely divorced from reality, but it was enough to set fire to Germany and trigger what he called a final solution. Today, we see extremist and terrorist groups swallowing the most egregious lies because over time, their trust in leadership confidence in a free press, their confidence in science, and their place in the status quo has been shaken until they're willing to destroy the very nation whose patriots they claim to be. Robert J. Lifton analyzed this phenomenon quite clearly in his book entitled, interestingly, Destroying the World in Order to Save It. The search for truth and meaning is free, but it must be responsible. For Unitarian Universalists, this responsibility means that while we respect the wide range of beliefs and approaches to life that exist in our congregations and in the world, there are tests of reality and of the well-being of life on earth against which any belief or approach to life must be measured. My anger at the mistreatment and distortion of the truth is keen, but I don't despair. While seeking some hope this week, I contacted our dear friend Alex Stain, an expert in cult psychology. It was Alex who pointed me toward Solomon Ash's experiment. And she reminded me that in the experiment, it only took one other voice to give the naive subject the courage to actually affirm what he was seeing with his own eyes. Unitarian Universalists should be able, even without that one ally, to speak the truth. And what this also means is that we have countless opportunities to restore and reclaim truth, facts, science. We often avoid these opportunities like the plague, staying in our safe bubbles of like-minded folk. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying the opportunities are everywhere around us. Now, neither Hannah Arendt or Alex Stain think there's any use in, for example, arguing with your family member who might be a creationist or a flat earther or whatever. You may not be able to make them hear you, but you can be authentic. Drop a flyer. Tell a story about your life, your faith. You can simply and apologetically speak truth using the reality that you know, simply, not in argument, but in conversation. You can be the person who allows some air into a sealed universe, who allows the naive subject to acknowledge the truth again. Or you can perhaps simply, bravely, visibly be the person who can follow a compass of principle toward a world that is beautiful, compassionate, and just. And they just may hear you. Science shows they probably will, in time, and be changed. Let them hear you. It is so moving to hear our choir. It is so moving to hear their voices and combined with 5 other choirs in our own sanctuary in 2018. Someday we will be back together in person and able to hear voices ring out with that kind of power. And until then, we will have to support one another in raising our voices in the service of truth and meaning, being witnesses, gentle and focused, for the well-being and wholeness of our world. Put your hands extended toward the outside frame so that our hands can safely touch. And you can repeat these words after me. I join my hands with yours so that we can do together that which we cannot do alone. We are blessed to have one another. I invite us to go forth from this service as free and responsible folk, in a spirit of peace and love, returning ever to this congregation with our hearts open and our hands ready to safely join together, to do the work of building the beloved community, which is the work of healing our world. And next week, I invite us all back to worship with 15 other Unitarian Universalist congregations in a revival of democracy. I look forward to seeing you there.